The first time the Security Council has passed a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza since the start of the war. The US abstaining from voting, the remaining 14 council members, obviously including the United Kingdom, voting for the resolution. So here is the moment, fairly historic moment, one has to say, when Japan's representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Yamazaki Kazuyuki, announced the result by the vote of 15 members of the UN Security Council, which saw the organisation call for that ceasefire.
The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 0 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2728, 2024.
Well, the feelings of those people are made pretty plain. Speaking immediately after the vote, the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, explained why she'd been unable to vote in favour of that motion, but declined to give specific details of why the US chose to abstain rather than using its veto, as it has on 3 previous occasions when the Security Council had voted on ceasefire motions.
Certain key edits were ignored, including our request to add a condemnation of Hamas. And we did not agree with everything in the resolution. However, we fully support some of the critical objectives, and we believe it was important for the Council to speak out and make clear that our any ceasefire must come with the release of all hostages.
The vote immediately sparked a furious reaction from Israel. Here is the country's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, speaking soon afterwards.
Your demand for a ceasefire, without conditioning it on the release of the hostages, not only is not helpful, but it undermines the efforts to secure their release.
And in a dramatic intervention later in the day, Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, cancelled a scheduled trip by senior delegation of officials to Washington, D.C., which had been arranged for later this week. This is what US National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told reporters overnight about that call from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
The Prime Minister's office seems to be indicating through public statements that we somehow changed here. We haven't. It seems like the Prime Minister's office is choosing to create a perception of daylight here when they don't need to do that.
And finally, speaking overnight, British Defence Secretary Grant Shapps. He spoke with broadcasters after the RAF airdropped 10 tons of aid into northern Gaza for the first time. He was also asked for his response to Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision to cancel the delegation's visit to Washington.
We're always very, very careful to separate out a democratically elected government, and Israel is a democratic society, from putting the blame on individuals. And it's perfectly possible, as I say, to disagree with the leadership of a country but still agree with the country's right to exist. And that is what the British government does. So what we're saying is it's very important to make sure that we can flood Gaza with supplies and aid. And Britain is going to play our part in making sure that that is what happens now.
Time to bring into the conversation Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who's Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem and Israel's Special Envoy for Innovation, joining me now. Good to have you on. Why no ceasefire, Deputy Mayor? Good morning.
Good morning. Well, we've already seen the result of the vote when Hamas this morning once again rejected a very reasonable proposal for a ceasefire in return for the hostages. So that is a direct correlation to, unfortunately, passing a vote that did not link the release of the hostages with the ceasefire last night in the UN. These things have consequences, and the terrorists are very aware of what they can get away with.
But it's a surely responsibility now for a democratic state such as Israel to abide by a UN resolution. The other side we're talking about are terrorists. That's not Israel, Deputy Mayor. I think
that's right, but that means that we're fighting an inherently very, very unfair war, because we have to follow all the rules and they have to follow none of the rules. And so how does that seem fair to you when we didn't even start this war? So it's a war we didn't start. We were brutally attacked, as you well know. They did unmentionable things to children and women. They continue to rape and torture our captives. And yet, somehow, we have to make a ceasefire with getting nothing back.
Deputy
nothing
Mayor,
at all. Does that seem fair to you?
Well, Deputy Mayor, you cite fairness. Can I ask, is it fair to continue to shell innocent Palestinians? And the number that the Hamas-run health authorities put out is that 32,000 of whom have died. This isn't about fairness now, is it? This is about seeking some form of resolution.
Let's unpack the numbers for a second.
Well,
we don't know if that's true.
I did say Hamas put the figure out, but
that's right.
You will accept thousands of people have
absolutely.
died.
But do you accept that 14,000 people of those who are apparently died are combatants? Because those are our numbers. Do you accept that?
I don't know. I'm sure I would hope, yes. I would hope it's more than 14,000.
So if we already accept that, we're not talking about 32,000 innocent civilians.
But you must...
It's bad enough. We're not talking about 32,000 innocent civilians.
Okay.
If we know the battalions that we've killed come to about 14,000 people. So let's try and take out the combatants into this very unfair, made-up number that everybody keeps quoting.
I hate this because
put things where they are.
Okay. We're still talking about thousands of innocent people. So, again, I don't know how we can cite fairness,
and let me tell
Deputy
you what's
Mayor.
fair. And let me tell you what's unfair.
Well,
what's unfair is that these innocent people are part of Hamas's defense strategy. That's what's unfair. They have 3 defense strategies. One is our hostages, and the second is their innocent people. And so when you're facing an enemy that is good for them when their own innocents die, how do you fight that war? How would any country fight that war? Let me ask you something else, Nikki. If it was your child in those dungeons, what would you want your government to do to get your child out?
I doubt if I would still have my sanity if my children were caught up in it.
What wouldn't you want your government to do to get your child out of that hellhole?
I understand that. I don't know if killing other children helps matters, but if we move more to a global...
We don't go to kill other children.
No, it's an unfortunate byproduct. I accept that, but it is...
There is zero intention to kill innocent civilians.
I know, but that is an unfortunate byproduct.
This is an unfortunate part of a war we did not start.
But if we move to the global aspect now, are you not fearful that it could seem Israel will become isolated, Deputy Mayor? You now have this vote, the first time the vote has gone through, and the US an abstention. That surely shows that there is a degree of isolation for Israel, Deputy Mayor.
Well, I'll tell you who is not complaining about us trying to get rid of Hamas, and that is the moderate Arab Sunni countries who understand who's behind all of this.
If we could stay with the UN, do you not think...
They're not complaining, and in fact, they want us to get rid of Hamas, as do Egypt and Jordan.
14
hear about them.
Okay, 14 council members voting in favour of the ceasefire resolution, the US abstaining. Again, lastly, Deputy Mayor, and I'm very grateful for your time, do you not think this risks Israel looking very isolated?
Maybe it does, but at the end of the day, we have an obligation to defend our citizens. And what happened on the 7th of October can never happen again. Hamas have clearly stated they will do it again. And so, unfortunately, we are fighting a war we have no choice but to fight.
All right. I hope the next time we can speak, it's on a more positive note as the hostages come home. Thank you for your time. Fleur Hassan-Nahoum is Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem and Israel's Special Envoy for Innovation. Listening to that is Carne Ross, former head of Middle East policy for the UK mission to the United Nations, former head of the Arab-Israel desk at the Foreign Office, joining me now. Those numbers again, 14 in favour, 1 US deciding to abstain. How surprised were you by the weight of support for the vote? Morning.
Morning. Not particularly surprised. I mean, the overwhelming majority of UN member states have called for a ceasefire for some time. I mean, the only surprise here is the shift in the US position from a veto to an abstention. But in a sense, the Americans are trying to have it both ways. Their abstention is about trying to prevent their own isolation in the UN and internationally for their unstinting support for Israel. But at the same time, in Washington in particular, they're emphasizing the so-called non-binding nature of the resolution. So with a wink and a nod, they're saying to Israel, you don't really need to implement this if you don't want to.
What of the reaction from the Israeli Prime Minister in cancelling the delegation that was due to go to Washington, D.C.? How do you respond to that?
I'm surprised by that because normally rows between Israel and the US are private. and bringing it out into the open is surely not in Israel's interests. But I think it's a mark of the isolation that Israel is now in. It's not a question, as you were saying to the deputy mayor, of Israel on its way to being isolated. It is already isolated. If this ceasefire resolution went to the General Assembly, I think you'd get almost every member of the United Nations, 193 countries of the world, demanding a ceasefire now.
Carne Ross, I will leave it there. I'm sorry we haven't more time. You're former head of Middle East policy for the UK mission to the UN, and you were head of our Israel desk at the Foreign Office. Just to clarify, of course, the person with whom I was speaking is Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, not the Deputy Mayor of Israel, but we'll take your views on her side to that conversation.